Good morning to all of you joining us from the United States, and a warm welcome to all our other participants. I'm Ashley Tellis, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and it's my great pleasure to host this discussion on Sino-Indian relations today. As all of us who follow this topic know all too well, relations between China and India have been somewhat topsy-turvy these past few years. The broad reasons for those developments are somewhat obvious, but the underlying drivers of the crisis, which manifested themselves visibly in 2020, from 2020 onwards, if not 2019, are still unclear. I am delighted to welcome two individuals, both scholars and friends, Saheb Singh Chadha and Tanvi Madan, to help us make sense of these tumultuous past few years. My Carnegie colleague, Saheb, actually provoked this discussion by publishing a superb paper negotiating the India-China standoff 2020 to 2024, which is the peg for our conversation today. But we could not have had a better respondent than Tanvi Madan, who is Senior Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., literally Carnegie's neighbor next door. Tanvi is the author of Fateful Triangle, How China Shaped US-India Relations During the Cold War. And I suspect it's fair to say that she has been immersed in trying to make sense of China-US-India relations all her professional life, a topic that I think will actually dominate our conversations this morning. So welcome to both of you, Saheb and Tanvi, and thank you for joining us this morning. I'll ask you, Saheb, to get us started by speaking for about 10 minutes, just laying out the broad themes of your paper. And then Tanvi, if you could take another 10 minutes to respond to some of the issues that Saheb raised, and then we'll go into a conversation among ourselves before we open it up to the floor. So over to you, Saheb.
Thank you, Ashley. It's a pleasure to be here. So, the paper essentially tries to answer two questions, the what question and the why question. As in, what has actually happened at the border over the past 4 years, and why did China escalate in the manner that it did in 2020? The answer to the what question forms the majority of the paper. And my answer is that the situation has not remained constant over the past 4 years. There have been periods of progress amidst the broader 4 year low in the relationship. So I'll briefly lay out the positions that India and China have taken on the standoff. India's position is that China is responsible for commencing the standoff in April-May 2020. Its stance is that disengagement should be followed by de-escalation in the border areas, and broader India-China relations and the normalization of them is dependent on this last point. China's position is that India is responsible for the tensions. While desiring a solution to the standoff, broader India-China relations should not be affected and bilateral exchanges should continue. And China believes that the border should be placed in an appropriate position in bilateral ties. It suggests that better overall India-China relations and progress on boundary talks will have trickle-down effects on the border situation. So I actually break up the standoff into three distinct phases which took place between 2020 and 2024. Phase one was April to September 2020, and I'll talk about this 5 month period in a bit of detail. It was really the crisis period when both sides came close to the brink of war on more than one occasion. It starts with the buildup of Chinese forces along the line of actual control in eastern Ladakh towards the end of April. In early May, you have the clash along the banks of the Pangong Tso, which is a lake in eastern Ladakh. And in the same time frame, in mid-May, the Chinese side attempts to change the status quo along the line of actual control in several locations. The talks to resolve these tensions start in a positive atmosphere, but on the night of 15th June, you have the Galwan incident. It's the first fatalities on the border in nearly 4 decades. You have 20 soldiers on the Indian sides who die, and on the Chinese side, you have at least 4 soldiers. The next day, India and China's foreign ministers have a conversation where Dr. Jaishankar, India's external affairs minister, says that these unprecedented developments will have a significant impact on the bilateral relationship. And thereafter, you see both sides attempting to manage the crisis and disengage or pull back forces from the eyeball to eyeball confrontation. Disengagement in the Galwan Valley completes towards the end of July, but talks to disengage from the other friction points that have cropped up as a result of China's attempts to change the status quo falter towards the end of August. And then the Indian Army, sort of sensing this, launches Operation Snow Leopard. Now, this was an operation where the Indian Army occupied the heights on the northern and southern banks of Pangong Tso, and these sort of threatened Chinese positions. Why? Because, of course, negotiations were faltering, and the Indian, if armed forces maintained, then this was in response to an attempt by the PLA to again change the status quo. This operation, along with political meetings of the Raksha Mantri, India's defense minister, and the external affairs minister in Moscow in September 2020, are sort of key in moving forward the negotiations on disengagement. Which brings us to phase two of the standoff, September 2020 to September 2022. This phase saw long drawn but successful negotiations on disengagement, with episodes of resistance from the Chinese at the negotiating table. Both sides, over the course of 2 years, disengaged in friction points around Pangong Tso in February 2021 and in the Gogra Hot Springs area in August and September 2022. That left both sides with the friction points of Depsang and Demchok, which brings us to the third phase, September 2022 to December 2024. Now, Depsang and Demchok are slightly different. Both sides differed considerably on these two friction points. The Chinese position was that Depsang and Demchok, the issues there are legacy issues that predate the standoff. So let both sides sort of move on and normalize ties and deal with these friction points as part of a normalized border management framework. India's position was that, sure, these were legacy issues that did predate 2020, but the situation on the ground changed qualitatively in the summer of 2020. Unless India and China disengage from these 2 points, then de escalate forces more broadly, there can be no normalization of India China ties. Now, these gaps sort of widened throughout 2023. You see the Indian side publicly, dare I say, rebuking the Chinese with the Raksha Mantri and the National Security Advisor, saying to the Chinese that you are eroding strategic trust and the public and political basis of the relationship. That attempt doesn't work. You have a BRICS summit in 2023 where Prime Minister Modi and President Xi don't have a full bilateral meeting. They exchange some words on stabilizing ties, but it doesn't really go anywhere. President Xi Jinping doesn't come for the G20 summit in New Delhi, and no subsequent disengagement takes place at the border that year. In 2024, you see a more positive approach from the Indian side. So for 3 years, India has been trying to compel China to disengage, and holding the bilateral relationship hostage was basically a threat from the Indian side. But compellence has to have both threats and reassurance. So 2024 sees the Indian side publicly express the importance it also attaches to the India-China relationship. This starts with Prime Minister Modi's interview before India's general elections in April 2024, when he says that the India-China relationship is important for Asia and the world. In June, you have a new government that comes to power in New Delhi, and that sort of provides an opportunity to reassess national security priorities, the costs that the standoff has incurred. And in July, on July 5th, Wang Yi and Jaishankar have a meeting where, for the first time, the Indian side talks about stabilizing and rebuilding bilateral ties. The Chinese had been saying this for the past 2-3 years, but this is really the first time the Indian side sort of come on board to this idea. You also have the economic survey that's released in July, which talks about investments from China and how sort of Indian industry has been hurt because since 2020, India has tightly sort of regulated investments from China. And so therefore, you have a series of meetings over the next few months of the co-commanders of the WMCC, which was a diplomatic track to sort of negotiate on the standoff, and also at the political level with the foreign ministers and with the national security advisors. And this results in an agreement in October on patrolling, which resolves the issues in Depsang and Demchok. You have a meeting of the principals, Prime Minister Modi and President Xi, for the first time in 5 years, and an announcement by Foreign Minister Jaishankar of disengagement in December. So as for tracking the standoff, the paper ends at that point. It then turns to the why question. Why did China escalate in the manner that it did in 2020? And this is a good question to ask because the Indian government has publicly said that it has not received a credible explanation for China's actions in 2020. And now the strategic community has sort of offered three explanations: that India's border infrastructure was threatening to the Chinese side, so China escalated to prevent this or deter this. Another explanation that's offered is that the India-US relationship, India's sort of tilted too close to the United States, so China's trying to coerce it back to a neutral posture. Now, individually, these explanations personally to me did not make much sense because if China was trying to deter India from a border infrastructure buildup, that's really not happened over the past 4 years. The infrastructure has only ramped up. And likewise, India and the United States have only grown closer over the past 4 years. My explanation is that all these explanations link under sort of one broader explanation, and which I get from Chinese government statements, Chinese think tanks which are affiliated to the Communist Party. The explanation is that China views India's border infrastructure buildup as a plan by the United States to contain China in Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. It sees it as a second front in the contest for the Indo-Pacific with the United States. So, very quickly, my thoughts on the future of India China's ties. The standoff is not over. Both sides still have to discuss the de escalation of the 100,000 or so troops that are deployed on either side. I don't think de induction is on the cards. I don't think it's feasible or desirable at this point. The normalization of India China ties has begun. You've had visits by National Security Advisor to Beijing in December for a round of special representative talks on the boundary question. You've had the Foreign Secretary recently visit Beijing and discuss broader ties, the resumption of people to people exchanges, economic exchanges, direct flights, and so on. So, both sides would also now discuss new confidence building measures to sort of, you know, decrease the likelihood of a situation such as 2020 cropping up again. And both sides, I think, will also have a broader discussion on evolving a new political understanding between India and China. And both sides have really made statements to this effect. So I think I'll stop there, Ashley.
Great. Thanks, Saib. That was actually a great overview. And let me actually compliment you on the paper because, irrespective of the conclusions, the documentary record that it establishes of the last 4 years is really going to remain valuable to scholars long after these details are forgotten. So, thank you for doing that. Tanvi, may I ask you to sort of offer your thoughts both on the broad thesis and any of the specifics. And then I have a series of questions that I want to pose to both of you. So thank you for doing this. Welcome.
Thanks, Ashley. It's always good to be cooperating with colleagues at Carnegie. And in this case, also a real pleasure because I think what Saheb has done is a really kind of valuable contribution. And I think it's valuable for three reasons. And I would actually say if you're kind of a scholar looking to see how you can add knowledge, this is something you should look at. Do not just, there's a lot these days of emphasis placed on opinion, but I think, creating knowledge is something that this paper does. As you said, Ashley, providing that documentary evidence. To me, it's a valuable contribution because one, it creates knowledge. Second, it provokes questions. And third, it actually, I think, sets up some interesting debates. And so I'll just kind of go through those three things in terms of why I think this is very much a worthwhile effort, but also creates perhaps an agenda for the future for what Saheb should be working on. Just in terms of, I think, why is this paper worthwhile for people not just to read, but have in their kind of, file folders, and they will probably refer back to, is that it creates this TikTok and of what happened over the 4 years. We often see analysts and scholars doing this for conflicts, for the actual conflicts, for the military dimensions, the TikToks of what happened when. I think what you see Saheb doing in this paper is do that for the negotiating side. And so trying to actually put those together, the military, the diplomatic, the political dimension is a really worthwhile effort. I think second, there's something that Saheb does that is actually useful more broadly if you want to understand, especially Indian foreign policy, which is textual analysis. It's painstaking, it's systematic what Saheb has done, and it's comparative, looking at what we have available from the Chinese side. And the reason I say this is a broader lesson is, people will say that we don't have access to sometimes information. Why isn't India, for example, naming China? What you see with Ministry of External Affairs documents is, if you just read even just the statements, there's a lot you can glean about what is said, how it is said, and frankly, what is not said as well. And I think you see Saheb doing that. And so a useful tool also for researchers to take this example of what Saheb Singh has done and continue. The third thing that Saheb has done, I think, is interviews, which, we often don't see, but I think married, triangulated with what is on what, he's seen from secondary sources, derived from that, but also in terms of the actual statements, going to that next level. So people like me are learning something new from what we've seen. So, for example, this one point where Saheb mentions that in that fall of 2020 period after the Galwan clash, where India was clearly kind of seeing Russia as a message passer, as a conduit, a channel to China at that point. So a useful, which some of us speculated about, but the fact that somebody actually said, yes, this is what we were doing. And then finally, I think, we really see Saheb in this, in especially the kind of what side of the papers, identify certain factors that have moved the ball forward. So, for example, talking about and documenting summits or meetings as action forcing events on both the back ends. So we're kind of leading into those meetings. They're used as, well, we won't meet if we don't get progress, but also after that action forcing events in terms of getting people to the next steps. I think you'll also see some other, you glean some other elements from Saheb's paper. This idea that dialogue mechanisms, one of the things we often heard is that India accusing China of violating the boundary agreements that the two sides had signed. But what we do see is that, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of dialogue mechanisms. That they did not, they proved to be useful in preventing escalation at the time, but also in trying to make some steps in terms of resolving the proximate problem, even though they weren't sufficient clearly to prevent the clash itself. And so as people talk about this kind of what's the next step in creating a new modus vivendi is the term often used, is do you need to update these agreements? Yes, but also to actually look at what did work. And one of the things you see is these mechanisms that frankly are actually more extensive than anything the US and China or the China and other countries have. I think, but the TikTok also kind of makes evident, as I said, that the dialogues weren't sufficient, not just in preventing the crisis, but arguably the dialogue alone also was not sufficient in getting progress within the negotiations itself. That there was a combination of sometimes military action. Saheb talks about Operation Snow Leopard in the fall of 2020 that made a difference. So that, looking at the combination of what was going on at the time, it wasn't dialogue alone, or that these mechanisms. I think what's also interesting about this paper, it tells us something about there's something about the style of statements as well that is we should derive lessons from. China, for example, and this comes out very clearly, tends to put words in others' mouths. Whoever it's negotiating, they will come out and put in statements that they agreed to this. And the lesson, I think, not just for India, and you saw India start to anticipate and rush to put out statements at a speed that went away from type, was that all of us need to understand that this shapes narratives. So the speed at which not letting China kind of anticipate some of these things. Let me just come to raising some of the questions. This paper raises some questions for me that I want to see answered, whether Saheb does that or, other scholars. One is, Saheb talks about this Operation Snow Leopard, this quid pro quo move that the Indian military undertook. I want to know, it strikes for me for the question, what was the thinking behind accepting the PRC, the disengagement at some points, using that to get disengagement at some points, but not holding out for multiple points? What was the thinking behind using that at that point and not holding that card for later? Or for that matter, why did India not hold on to those heights? Was it just a point of leverage, not, as Saheb argues in points, that it was also part of an effort to prevent further crises? So one question is there. Second, Saheb lays out phases, and there's a second phase to a third phase where he says, the gap widens between China and India. Was it really the gap that widened between India and China, or does it turn out that Depsang and Demchok are actually what China might have wanted to hold on to, and it's really that the talks hit a ceiling for a while till a confluence of conditions helped move the ball forward. I think one other thing, the questions that we have to be aware of is, one question I have is, were there differences in the PRC statements that we do have? Were there differences in the English language versions and the Chinese language versions? Maybe, this is for somebody who can do textual analysis in Mandarin as well. But I think there's this kind of broader, set of questions that, to me, and perhaps debate that the paper raises to some of the broader questions. And this goes to the why, the causes part of Saheb's papers. I think, Saheb, you make a convincing case that, we've heard all these arguments. I think you do give us evidence for at least two, one more on the tactical side, that, there might have been an opportunistic salami slicing move that is connected to Xi Jinping's efforts to actually move forward on sovereignty claims. And so that might have been, this was about seeing a moment and moving on that. I think you also offer some evidence and talk about the debate on the US factor, that China has had broader concerns about the India getting closer to the US. And others have outlined how Yun Sun and others, there's been a debate amongst India watchers in China that actually, some saying that if you do things like this, if you press India, it'll move closer to the US. And others saying, well, India is already close to the US. In fact, we need to put it in its place or constraints options. I think you laid those out quite well in terms of what the debate is. To me, the less convincing part, and I'd like you to kind of lay out a little bit more about why you see it, is this link. You say that it was China saying that not only was the US the broader strategic context, but that it was the factor driving India to make the infrastructure build up or this thing. I have not seen, even broadly, that argument made. And I'd like you to lay out more, because I'm not quite convinced that link between those two has been established at that point. Now, some of this is not about your paper. It's the information asymmetry, not just access to Chinese officials. Sometimes that's a black box in general. We're still debating to some extent the causes of the 1962 war and the thinking behind it between India and China. Just a couple of other things, Ashley, if I may. One is, I do think we need to be careful and all of us who look at textual analysis, and this raises the other question I have for you is, what's not in the statements? Statements give us things that are in there. And so to me, it's that, you've given us the what happened, when it happened. I want to know more about the why it happened. The context. What was going on at the time when China and India were meeting, especially when their positions changed, and frankly, times when you'd have thought the positions would change and they didn't. So the dog that didn't bark for me is partly July 2023, when there was an action forcing event. There was a BRICS summit. Both Modi and Xi were going to be there. There was a lot of chatter that they might move forward, and they didn't. So what was happening around is quite important, because it gives you a sense of perhaps the reasons that have driven the two countries to this point. And we know what those we've seen some. I've written, others have written about, okay, what might those reasons have been for the two countries to kind of finally decide we're going to move forward, at least in this current phase of disengagement. One is on the China side, it was facing strategic and economic headwinds, uncertain about the upcoming US election at the time, and decided that this was worthwhile to do. For India, a series of reasons, not wanting to see a de escalation, having other domestic and economic foreign priorities, including dealing with a series of crises and their fallout from Europe and the Middle East, but also wanting to buy time to build capabilities, as well as some of the economic actors in India saying we need to start getting back to doing some amount of business with China. Also, India worried that all its other partners had been engaging with China at that point, the US, Australia, even Japan. And then finally, even for India, uncertainty about what might happen in the US election, but more importantly, whoever was the winner, what was their China approach going to be? Now, why does this matter? Why does this kind of the context of the why was these changes, these factors? Because if the outcome, that is this disengagement, was a result of particular a moment when certain factors or conditions were in place, what happens if they change? What now if we have more, if the country is feeling less headwinds, if that's China or India, if they feel more certain about their equation with the US, does that mean the outcome changes? And so that question of why, I think, is important as well. What was happening at the time? What might change? I'll end with saying that, one of the things the paper does is, I think, lay out this process of disengagement. But like Saheb, I am a little bit more skeptical that we're going to see, the way I described it in July when it was evident something like this would happen, is that this is a tactical thaw, but it's not a strategic shift. There's an interesting paper to be written about what a strategic shift, what might cause a strategic shift. But we've seen kind of that the border standoff itself hasn't been resolved. Neither have the series of differences, bilateral, regional, global, between India and China. So some of the questions aren't just, okay, what happens next for these two countries if they do want to maintain that current stabilized form? What is their next steps in terms of that modus vivendi, that new set of agreements? But also, are they going to try to ease some of their more the kind of elements of their strategic rivalry, or is this just a convenient tactical thaw for now that the two want to maintain, but that strategic rivalry will not just continue, but even intensify over time as the two sides' capabilities do over time? And this is where I come to the last point, really, that I will make, which is, will this sustain? And and some of the factors that we already we can see debated, but one of the factors that I think, and perhaps we'll talk about this a little bit more, is Sahib, your point about the US role in all this, and how, whether directly and indirectly, it contributes to what is happening, that India-China relations do not exist in a vacuum. And so one question for me is, how does the Trump factor really kind of make a difference to this tactical side, but also potentially the strategic side? Regardless, I am of the view, and I suspect both of you are, that if you are India, you should take what Saheb says in his paper. Don't underestimate the Chinese will to use force for to make territorial claims. Frankly, that's a lesson for the US as well. And so you should be prepared, regardless of what is happening in these other factors, including what Trump might do about China, about India. You should be prepared, regardless, that anytime that move can be taken, even if you are engaging in diplomacy to ensure that it is not.
Great. Thank you, Tanvi. That was actually fabulous, because I think it gives us some grist for a conversation that continues. Let me start by asking some elementary questions, in a sense, pertaining to this affair, because Sahib, you started off by describing a series of antecedent events prior to June 2020. crises that began actually in late April, going on throughout May, and then June occurs. Do you have the sense, and I'd like Tanvi to weigh in on this as well, do you have the sense that what actually happened at Galwan was in some sense premeditated, or was this an accident just waiting to happen? And if it was the latter, was the real problem the events itself, or the inability of the Chinese to salvage the situation quickly after the loss of life? I mean, in other words, you could have inadvertent consequences of confrontations, right? And those are bad by themselves. But how you manage those consequences immediately after they occur really defines the trajectory that follows. So if you believe this was premeditated and that the Chinese wanted to send India a lesson and were willing to take all the risks involved, including loss of life, then that's a certain path that is sort of predestined. But if you believe that this was inadvertent, it was not something that they intended, but then failed in their diplomacy to salvage these unfortunate consequences, then of course it takes you in a different direction. So, just based on your reading of all the literature that you cite, what is your judgment just about the specifics that occurred in June 2020?
So I think the antecedent events that you mentioned played a big role in the mistrust that was sort of leading up to June 2020. I mean, the so you started with the Pangong clashes in on May 5th, and in mid-May you had the attempts by the Chinese side to change the status quo in seven separate locations across eastern Ladakh. And in some sense, this was treated as a strategic escalation by the Indian side, and the Raksha Mantri went on record to say this was a serious disturbance. You know, you're violating agreements, and particularly the violent conduct of Chinese forces in violation of your standard operating procedures was a big concern. So this was the background in which sort of Galwan took place, and I think these developments really made it sort of a ticking time bomb leading up to Galwan. And I don't think Galwan was premeditated. From what I've heard, what I've read, and from the people I've spoken to, it was an accident. It was the fog of war, and but if there had been a broader atmosphere of trust between the two sides and of sort of good faith negotiation, I think perhaps that escalation, that sort of incident could have been managed slightly better. And it certainly would have. But given that that was not there, I think it played out the way it did. Yeah, that's what I'll say on that question.
Okay. Tanvi, do you concur with that judgment?
I concur that I don't think Galwan, the clash itself, was premeditated. I do think we have sufficient evidence that the broader standoff, the moves were. But I think the reason, I think there's some interesting work to be done about were there conditions, including at the on an operational and tactical level, lessons about civil-military relations, what it says about the role of the party within the military, the sense of kind of the wolf warriordom that contributed to it. So, for example, what do we, is it that the PLA, we know that the Indian military is often told, don't escalate. That's not your default, is not to escalate. But is this an incident where if you are the commanding officer on the PLA side, you are more worried that you will be penalized by your superiors for de-escalating rather than holding your ground or being more assertive? Does this say to us that there's some, are there going to be lessons learned on the Chinese side? Or is it just the nature, there's so many people have done work on, the nature of militaries, and especially in not just kind of authoritarian societies, but it matters how they are structured. And is it that they don't delegate certain decisions to that operational. It could be something like that. The other question, though, I have is, okay, this is an accident, is kind of the question, I think, similar to yours, Ashley, which is, if this was an accident, why did it take China so long to actually try to fix this? To actually say, look, this is actually a wake-up call that these things could go out of whack really quickly. But the second thing, it says something, we often talk in kind of India world about, well, India needs more expertise in China. But this is also an instance of China on a strategic level not understanding the reaction this would provoke in India and moving quickly to fix it. Because the fact that it was left for 4 years, this crisis ongoing, it ended up having impacts on India's getting closer to the US, building capabilities, etc. It's one of those, in hindsight, questions or alternative, pathways that had China said, okay, this is a wake up call, let's try to resolve this now. As was done. I mean, Doklam, the previous standoff took 73 days, but there were other standoffs that were resolved much more quickly. Had they done that, would we have seen India take some of these steps to restrict China in many ways in Indian society, economy, etc., or move closer to the US and the Quad countries in ways that they have? Had we have seen that if China would have stepped in then and said, this was an accident, we need to actually, kind of pull back, not actually start making some of the soldiers who were killed, making them heroes, having the CEO, at the Olympics opening ceremony, etc.
This really raises questions to which we don't have answers today, right? Because they go to the heart of Xi Jinping's policies and the way he's conducted China's relations with the world during that second term, where there was a complete lack of imagination, a lack of tactical adroitness. There was a sort of bull in the china shop, pardon the metaphor, sort of attitude that they had. And India was part of that. There were other countries in Asia that also were bearing the brunt of this in so many ways. But I think the point you make is really a good one, because on one hand, he has tasked the PLA to defend the sacred frontiers without compromise. And if that is a sort of governing principle for PLA activity along its borders, then in some ways this crisis was preordained, because you see the crises even before 2020, right? The crises in 2017, and so on and so forth. So we need a better clarity on how China's own calculations, in a sense, contribute to this. But the larger question, which I was left scratching my head actually after reading Saheb's work, is that the explanations at the level of process for changes in Chinese positions are sensible. There's a meeting, they want a good outcome, therefore they do X. But, these decisions about fundamental shifts are not driven entirely by process, right? Though process obviously matters. So what is happening in the Chinese calculation about its interests vis-a-vis India that are compelling this change? And I think that is a story that still needs to be told. And to my mind, let's focus on just one particular phase. What is it that accounts for the shift between July 2024 and October 2024? So we know that there is a standoff at Depsang and Demchok, which goes back to 22. The Chinese are digging in and they won't move. And there's a back and forth, for 2 years, really, September 22, July 2024, between India and China. China basically saying, you can't hold the relationship hostage. India basically saying, we can't have a normal relationship unless you fix this. And then suddenly, something melts quite quickly between July and October, which is when Vikram Misri makes the announcement that we have an agreement. And then, of course, 2 months later, Dr. Jaishankar goes to Parliament and declares the end of the problem. In your judgment, what changed after July? Is it simply that the Chinese said, oh, this has been going on for too long, we can't afford to lose India to the Americans? Is it that, oh my God, it appears like Trump might finally, be somewhere on the horizon, ready to make a comeback, and that changes the environment greatly? Is it that Xi Jinping, in his third term, begins to think about having a more flexible policy, both domestically and abroad? What, in your judgment, accounts for this change?
So, so I think the incentives on the Chinese side. So some incentives were constant throughout the past 4 years. That India had also uh, counter-blocked Chinese patrols in Depsang and Demchok. In Depsang, it had prevented them from coming up to Butsa, and similarly in Demchok, they'd been blocked. So that restriction on patrolling was there for the past 4 years. There was a cost to the Chinese in maintaining this posture in Tibet. Given how far it is from like the proper Chinese mainland, there's a high logistics sort of tooth to tail ratio there. And I think what changed July onwards specifically was, it's hard to say some of these with sort of conclusive evidence. So you've heard about sort of Chinese economy slowing down, perhaps India's needed as a market. But I think one specific issue in July onwards was, at that time, sort of Donald Trump was really doing well in the US elections, and it wasn't very clear what was sort of Joe Biden's campaign going to turn out like. I think that was an important consideration for the Chinese. They wanted to stabilize this front in preparation for, just the unpredictability of Trump. No matter which way it goes, you just want to sort of keep that one front stabilized. I have a slightly one reason I think this really happened this year is, in 2024, was China has the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's summit's presidency this year in 2025. And so the summit's going to be somewhere in China. And I don't think China would have liked to miss out on having Prime Minister Modi visit Beijing or any other part of China for the summit. And perhaps doing this in 2025 would have been a bit too on the nose and a bit too transactional publicly. And I think, given that India does matter sort of as sort of a global South player, an online player, and Shanghai Cooperation Organization's importance in Central Asia, I think Beijing, one of the sort of considerations was that we should do this now and not next year. But I think the Trump thing was really sort of the more overwhelming consideration at that point. Yeah.
Let me take one question from our audience members, and this goes specifically to some of these issues. The question is that the individualized nature of these border standoffs are quite obvious, right? Locations are discrete. It's not a general problem across the border. So the participant asks, does the individualized nature of these individual standoffs create a case for a blanket solution that addresses the entire disputed area? Or must the solutions come in piecemeal form as they've come so far, that you negotiate these discreetly, incident by incident, location by location? Tanvi, what do you think about this?
So I think, you've seen Prime Minister Modi when he first came to office in 2014, when he was hosting Xi Jinping. Ahead of that visit and during that visit, he in fact said India and China should not just try to manage the border dispute, but actually try to move some steps towards resolving it. And India has proposed for years, even before Prime Minister Modi, that the first step to that is demarcation. And that is something, and he, I think, if I remember correctly, publicly said as much when he went in April 2015 to China for his first visit as Prime Minister there. The Chinese side has not been wanting to do that. They have talked about a broader settlement. We haven't heard for a while, it comes up, the swap agreement that essentially they recognize India's claims to Arunachal, and then India recognizes their claim to Aksai Chin. But the complication with that is it still leaves you with the problem that those, at the locations, this is the longest undemarcated border in the world. And there still has not, even when that was proposed and the conditions for that were very different, the future of a place like Tawang was not, has not been kind of agreed to. So I think one thing is, you need, would it make sense? Yes, it would actually, at least take the reduce some of the situation at the, or the point of escalations, the prospect of escalation at the border. I still think this won't solve the broader rivalry between India and China, but it would take some of this. Now, one can argue that if you're China right now, you might be sitting and thinking about the capabilities gap question here too. Is that, earlier there was a lull between India and China between 1988 and 2012 or 2013. You didn't really see deep border. Lots of things have happened. Even India has upgraded the infrastructure. Some of this is people are just bumping up against each other a lot more. You're actually seeing that the other side is setting up a tent because you can get there now. There's better verification through kind of drones and things like that, and better kind of intelligence as well. But this broader question of, does it actually suit China to have India tie down all these troops in this location to keep India on its toes? Does it say that actually we have the upper hands? Our economy is over 5 times that of India. Military defense budget is over 3 times. That actually we don't need to kind of settle this on India's terms. So I think there are those broader questions that have frankly dogged India-China relations for ages that I think persist today. And then finally, this question, which I think it's always connected to, this has never been, for India, maybe China looms much larger, has loomed larger. For China, it is the US factor that, even if it's not the proximate cause, it is the prism through which China looks at a lot of issues. And one other explanation we don't have, in 2020, it wasn't just the India border that China was pushing against. They were hassling a number of South China Sea claimants. East China Sea was tense as well, the Taiwan Strait. So did this have something to do with how Xi Jinping was feeling about COVID, about his position? Was he feeling weaker or stronger? So I think there are a lot of these questions that are linked to this border question and what might potentially have with it. I think what we'll end up is maybe, at best at this point, that middle ground where Saheb has talked about, okay, can we at least update these agreements to reflect new realities?
So one of our participants here has asked a larger question, which deals with the issue of Tibet in the context of the border. Saib, what do you think? The question is, to what extent does the unresolved Tibet issue influence China's broader approach to border negotiations with India? And I presume that the questioner means by unresolved Tibet issue the larger question of Tibet's relations within China, India's relations with Tibet through the emigres who exist in India, and then, of course, all the territorial questions related to the Tibet of the Raj and the agreements that have created all these anomalies now in Sino-Indian relations. How does Tibet play into this, if it does at all?
So I think Tibet plays in 2 ways. One is China has sort of internal security considerations in Tibet, and you sort of really see that in 2022, China enacts a new border law, which speaks to sort of its concerns in Tibet about, guidelines for Tibetans in the border areas to follow to assist the PLA in the upkeep of security. So I think there is definitely a domestic angle here that influences China's posture towards Tibet and the border with India. And you see this sort of manifest in China's Xiaokang border villages that it's been setting up all along the border with India. It's some of those are in disputed pockets, but you see that it is motivated by domestic considerations of providing development, economic opportunities to the Tibetans, but at the same time, China sort of doesn't display this sensitivity for stepping on, for lack of a better word, for stepping on India's toes in that context. So I think it definitely does. In the domestic Tibet situation does influence the foreign situation. I just want to come to the question you asked Tanvi about what can a blanket de-escalation really be considered? I don't think that's the way they'll go about it, because it's not just, to my knowledge, it's not just Ladakh where the force posture has been increased. It's also the middle sector and the eastern sector. So I think it will depend on two variables. One is geography. It's easier to sort of de-escalate, de-induct in some places than it is in others. It's difficult broadly. But for example, in Arunachal, you'll have jungles, high altitude jungles, glaciers, etc. In Ladakh, it's a barren desert. So that's one factor. Second is, the differing perceptions of the LAC, and I think the tendency will be to a bit more cautious where you have overlapping perceptions and that perhaps a contingency may arise in these areas. But for example, in 2020, you really saw the Chinese side advance claims that it previously had not, and sort of opened up new areas of dispute. So the government will also keep a watch on not just the already differing areas of perception, but across the border as well, to ensure that other areas sort of don't pick up pace. Yeah.
Now, you were very pessimistic in your last couple of sentences of your presentation about de-induction, by which I think you mean withdrawing the forces that are currently along the border and returning them to their peacetime barracks, sort of in the rear. Are both of you of the view that we are likely to see large concentrations of military forces at the front for the foreseeable future? Or given that we have now got some agreements with respect to disengagement, presumably we can hope for de-escalation in the future? Because Dr. Jaishankar himself has argued that the next job for both sides is to talk about de-escalation, which I take it means some withdrawal of forces and so on and so forth. But what is your judgment about the posture that both sides are likely to maintain in the aftermath of these agreements? And if you could also say a couple of things. I have a question here actually from the audience, which asks about the effects of the PLA's increased use of autonomous platforms. What is the impact of this? And I take it this means drones and other surveillance devices and so on and so forth. What is the impact of this on the posture as well? And the question that I've always had is, if both sides had reasonably good surveillance of the border, do they actually need to maintain troops persistently in contact, or at least in some areas where rapid reinforcement is possible, they could actually pull forces back and thin down the numbers on the front? What are your thoughts on this? Tanvi first.
I think, that had been my thought too, that, you have better verification. It also helps you be more assured about the agreements you've signed, and keep both sides honest to some extent as well. I think one of the reasons you've heard some skepticism on the part of some of India's China hands that next step of de-induction will be taken is the combination of the buildup and also geography and terrain. And that particularly in Ladakh, one of the concerns they've expressed about India agreeing to a de-induction is that China has the advantage in certain key spots in terms of being able to re-induct troops from the depth areas than India does, despite all the improvements. So you do see India kind of upgrading some infrastructure, but there are certain amounts of geography, I guess, that it can't be overcome, or geographical advantage. I think there's the broader issue of trust to me that is going to take, I don't know if it's possible to rebuild it. If so, it is going to take a long time on both sides. And it goes to that Tibet question as well. We often talk about, because it's more proximate, kind of India now not trusting China or trusting that the agreements will hold. For India, those boundary agreements were part of its deterrence strategy. It thought it would deter China. It has learned that China is not deterrable by agreements alone, that it will not necessarily stick to its word. You've heard other Indian officials talk about other things, saying China is committed to X, but it's already gone, set up military bases abroad, or things like send troops abroad in ways that it had said it would not. And so this idea that if you are assuming you will de-induct on the basis of that China will stick to that agreement, uh, and then this question comes, okay, today you can verify with autonomous platforms whether or not it's sticking to the agreements. But then are you willing to do something about it? If you are an Indian prime minister who doesn't want to escalate, and you say, okay, they might be doing that, I don't want to get back into this. But you have a public that now has some, maybe not as granular intelligence. They'll be saying, well, they are actually building up. Because today it doesn't require, the autonomous platforms actually make that information, close the gap in the information available to government and public in some senses. Yep. So I think the trust factor, and I think it's going to be very hard for India to trust that China will stick to its word, even with verification, better verification. But I think there's an aspect on the China side too. This is the Tibet point. China doesn't trust India as well. Maybe not on this specific, but part of the problem on their end with Tibet is they see, whether you agree with it or not, they see the presence of the Dalai Lama as a provocation and a reason in India, as a reason India cannot be trusted. And even when you go back to the 50s, the border crisis is intimately linked, and the decisions on the border, to how China was feeling about incorporating Tibet. And saying, and this is where the US angle came in, that the reason we can't trust India is that it is colluding with the US to have instigated, the escape of the Lama, all these things. So seeing it both as a reason not to trust India, but also not to trust Indian engagement with the US.
I think that is, to my mind, actually the nugget that in Saheb's paper really leaped out at me. It's less the question, in my judgment, that it was the US propelling India's infrastructure buildup, right? India had autonomous reasons for doing that apart from the US. But I think the fact that India was seen as coming closer and closer to the US. And, Francine Frankel and Harry Harding had this great book in the early 2000s it's an edited book, about what the US needs to know about Sino-Indian relations and stuff. And the point that Harry makes in the conclusion, which has always sort of struck me, is that China worries about India when it becomes a plus one to another great power. The Soviet Union in the 70s, animated the Chinese endlessly because they saw it as the plus one. Now with the United States, they see India as the plus one. And so whether that has specific impact on infrastructure or not, I think the fundamental sort of tectonic tensions between China and India just intensify as long as the leadership in Beijing sees India as quote unquote colluding, with the United States. And now that US-China relations have become sort of nasty, the temptation to see ghosts of collusion everywhere in Asia, I suspect, are extremely intense in Beijing, right? Which is not going to go away. So I have one last question before we close, and it comes again from the floor. And that is, how could the perceived camaraderie between Trump and Modi in the early period of this new administration in Washington escalate tensions at the border? The Prime Minister will be visiting the United States in a few weeks. How do you all read something like this being perceived in Beijing? And what does that mean for the China-India relationship? Saheb, if you go first.
Yeah, so I think given that India and China have sort of invested a lot of diplomatic, political, military capital in bringing this border situation to this point, I don't think we'll be very quick to necessarily see the border heat up again sort of immediately. It might happen in the future, but I don't think it'll happen in this early period of the Trump administration. That's on that question, Ashley, but I wanted to sort of come in on the question you asked about de-escalation, de-induction. The fact is that the government of India has not publicly ever talked about de-induction. So the question that raises in my mind is whether de-induction is even desirable. Maybe some of this military posture on the border is actually necessary and will be retained. And I think it'll be difficult because to de-induct on the Indian side and on the Chinese side are two very different things, because the Chinese have a flat plateau in Tibet which is far more easy to de-induct from, whereas the Indians have to navigate high Himalayan mountain passes, avalanche prone, landslide prone highways, tunnels to sort of get to the border. So I don't think it'll be very desirable. And I do think this situation will persist as long as the broader trust deficit exists, which Tanvi also spoke about. I think there's a question about the agreements, and I don't think one should throw the baby out with the bathwater. As has been said, the agreements do matter. They clearly did serve a purpose under certain political conditions between 1993 and, let's say, 2012. I think the thinking has to go into how do we sort of bring about a more political consensus that can undergird and sort of hold up these agreements at the border. And then I suspect one might see more success with them.
Tanvi, you get the last quick word.
Just very quickly, I think as much as we watch kind of the Trump-Modi dynamic, I would say it's important to look at the Trump-Xi dynamic, which I think might be more consequential. Because as much as the sense is that India or that China acts against India because it is concerned about its relationship with the US, we've also seen that China has actually tended to press India when India-US relations aren't as good, and when China is feeling more comfortable with its US relationship. So think about Doklam just a few months after Mar-a-Lago. Think about 2013, 2014, when actually India-China relations arguably were in a better space than India-US relations, which were in a bit of a lull. So to me, the question is, yes, we can watch. If you see a good Trump-Modi meeting, it might lay the ground for more defense cooperation, more technology. The other thing that might concern China is if the Quad talks more explicitly about its security dimensions and those are emphasized. But I think more important, I would say, and what I think might be more consequential, is the path that President Trump takes on China. And I'm not one of those people who thinks we know yet whether he will kind of invest in that engagement side, do a deal, or he continues that competitive approach. As they say in Hindi, abhi movie baki hai. The movie is still, we've yet to see the rest of this movie.
Well, on that note, I suspect we will have reason to have more of these conversations in time to come, because I agree with you, Tanvi. The uncertainties about US-China policy are actually quite acute, despite all the stuff that is in the airwaves about competition and so on and so forth. And so we will have to watch the impact of this on our allies, on our partners like India, and so on and so forth. But I want to thank the two of you for really spending the time with us this morning. Saheb for a superb paper, Tanvi for great comments, and I look forward to joining you again at some point, either virtually, and I hope to see you all in person soon. Let me also take the opportunity to thank the audience for joining us this morning, and I look forward to welcoming you back to Carnegie, either in virtual or physical form, in the not too distant future. Take care, all of you. Have a good evening or a good day, depending on wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Saheb.
Thanks, Tanvi.